What is happening, friends? Welcome to Tanzu TV Code Edition on a Wednesday. What is today's date? Today is Wednesday, April 6th, 3 o'clock here on the East Coast. We are going to be talking about Spring for GraphQL today. So I've got a lot planned. We'll see what we can actually get to. The family has been sick for the last couple of weeks. I seem to be getting a little of that today. So I had planned to go for a certain amount of time, but we'll see. We'll see how long that lasts today. Anbu, hi, how are you? Thanks for joining us today. So I'm just gonna give it a couple minutes for some people to get in. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share my screen and just talk a little bit about what my plan is today. So if you're new here, this is Tanzu TV Code. So we have a show called Code. Every week, one of the developer advocates will get on here and just hack away at some code. And it's a really great opportunity for us to just kind of work on some things that we're working on at the moment and, do it, share that with you guys in as they say, learning in public. So here is the episode. If you're not familiar with code, head over to this Tanzu Developer Center. You'll see a whole bunch of past episodes on here with some just amazing content. All of it's free. So check that out. Here we are today, Spring for GraphQL. So just letting some people come in. Let me know where you're joining us from. How you doing? A beautiful Wednesday here outside of Cleveland, Ohio, if you could see that backdrop. We've actually got some warm weather today. It's like 60. We don't get that. We haven't seen that in a while, so excited about that. If I feel better, I may try and get outside for a little bit tonight. All right, so we're going to do a lot of coding today. But first, I just want to kind of talk about GraphQL in general. So again, the reason we're kind of talking about this today is that we have a Spring 1 tour coming up. So where are we here? Spring 1. Where is this on the website? That is not right. There it is, Spring 1 tour. So we have a tour coming up later this month. Our first stop, we are back and in person. We're going to be in Chicago. We have a 2-day conference here. Just a whole bunch of really great content. Cloud native architecture. Do the login page first, which is by my friend Deshaun Carter. If you're wondering why I have earbuds in when I'm the only one here, Sean may join us today, so I didn't want to miss that, so I put my earbuds in. God, just so many great talks here. Kubernetes, native Java from Josh Long. Spencer Gibb is speaking. An intro to Kubernetes. Who should use Kubernetes? Can you Tanzu? So that's just day 1, and then if we look on day 2, getting started with GraphQL for Spring Boot. So I'll be speaking on day 2. So I'm excited about that. So we're going to just talk about GraphQL in general and then look at Spring for GraphQL. So I want to talk quickly about kind of my introduction to GraphQL. I'm by far not a GraphQL expert, but I have used it for, a couple of years now. Not on the server, more on the client. So this is my personal website, danvega.dev. There's a bunch of info on here. I write and create a bunch of content. So whether it's my newsletter, so if you go into newsletter, there are a bunch of past issues. If you want to sign up for free, you can do that here. I have a blog where I have all of these articles that I've written. I have courses. So, and then all of these things like about and contact are pages. So what I'm using here is a project called GridSum. And GridSum is a Jamstack framework for Vue.js. And really what I love about this is it kind of just pulls all of these sources into a GraphQL layer. So whatever data you're working with, it's in GraphQL. You just need to query or mutate or subscribe to the particular query that you need to. And so that's what I really loved about this from the get-go. And so if we think about that, we have things like newsletters and blogs and courses and pages. So these are all items on the GraphQL layer or objects on the GraphQL layer that we can go ahead and query for. So the reason I tell you this is I want to show you kind of how I got into GraphQL and kind of a first step for me. So I'm going to run my website locally. This is my website here in Visual Studio Code, and we can just run gridsum develop. And it's going to start up two things for me. It's going to start up my server, and it's also going to give me this localhost 8080 __ explore. And so one of the things you'll find with GraphQL right away, and let's just close that so we can start fresh, is that it's very developer friendly. There's a lot of reasons for that, but this is something you get out of the box for free. I didn't have to do anything to get this. The project that we're going to create in Spring for GraphQL today, we have a Graphql, I think that's how you spell it. This is like a GraphQL Playground one. But there are these playgrounds where you get to write your different queries and test them out. And this comes for free. We didn't need to like set up anything to do this. And so what it lets you do is start to play around with the query language. So GraphQL has a specific query language. It is not SQL, it is not JPA, it's not anything that you've used before. It's its own custom query language. Some would call it a DSL, a domain-specific language. And so that's really the first thing you need to get into, like understanding how to query a GraphQL server. So this is the client. There's a server running on my local machine using Node in this case. But now this will allow me to query the GraphQL server. One thing that's really great here, if you've ever worked in REST, it's really hard to keep up with documentation on REST APIs. And if you don't generally write a REST documentation from the get-go or use one of the projects out there that will kind of generate it for you, I've found in the past that it just doesn't get done. And so now you're kind of playing that guessing game of, okay, where's the endpoints for REST? What am I going to get back from this return? What does the request look like? What are the error messages? You know, all those things. So one thing I appreciate about GraphQL is here in the playground, I come over here and I can click docs. And between docs and schema, it's going to tell us everything. It's going to introspect the GraphQL server, the schema, and let us know what's available to us. So right away, we have this kind of self-documenting system that will tell us what is available to us. And so, yeah, I won't go through any slides that I have for the Spring 1 tour. I'm sure you don't want to see that. We want to see some code today. But really, the power of GraphQL is the client gets to request the exact data that they need. So you can imagine a scenario where on a website, on a large e-commerce site, on a desktop where you have all this screen real estate and a fast connection and, you know, everything at your availability, we can just return a whole bunch of data to that, right? Now, when we get into, say, a mobile device where the form factor is smaller, the connection is slower, battery life is a real issue. We get into IoT devices like a toaster or a refrigerator, you know, that's even less than a mobile device, right? So we have to start thinking about those things when we're creating our APIs. And so that's one of the problems, well, the problem that really GraphQL has set out to solve, and it's done a very good job of that. It lets each client retrieve the data that they need. So no longer are the days do we have to keep setting up more and more endpoints for, you know, the different clients that want to talk to our services. So the reason we're starting here is I just want to talk about the query language first. So the query language is Again, it's specific to GraphQL. We start with a query. Now this can be omitted, and if it is omitted, it will work just fine, but I like to be a little bit verbose. And you can't omit it when you're using something like a mutation or a subscription. So I like to just be verbose here. You could name this, but I'm not going to name this. And now when we're doing a query here, we're looking at the docs here. We're saying, okay, what are the queries that I have available to me? And the great thing is here in the editor, it's going to give us some IntelliSense, some code completion. So I want to grab all the newsletters. So as I start typing, you see, oh, okay, I have some things here. Now if I escape out of this right away, it's going to be like, there's an error here. I cannot do that. There is no query field out on type query. So what we can do is we can come in here and say all newsletter. All right, and now we're going to go into newsletters. So all newsletters, if I jump over here and click into that, you can see that now all newsletters has a bunch of parameters that we can go ahead and customize. So if we want to say limit the amount of, well, actually let's sort first. So let's sort by, sort by date descending, I think that's okay. So let's just say I want to limit this to a single newsletter. So I can do that. So this is the information. These are arguments that we can pass to this query, right? So now that I've got that, what's going to be returned is a newsletter connection. So now a newsletter connection has a few things on it. It has a total count. So we can say, hey, I want to go ahead and get the total count. That might be useful. I think we'll go into this now. If you look in here, there are some, so the types on here are Scholar types. And these are things like strings and ints and floats, and booleans, or custom types. The exclamation point says, whenever you get this, you're going to get something back. You're not going to get a null back. So we're guaranteed to get something back if there's a little exclamation point there. So that's good to know. When you see brackets around it, that says, hey, I'm going to return to you a collection of things. So we're going to get a bunch of them. So I don't really need anything about the page info. I know I'm getting one here, but I thought I'd just grab that anyway. And if I drill down into edges, edges is going to return to me a collection of newsletter edges. So let's say edges, and here we are again. In edges, there's a node, a next, and a previous. So we can kind of step through these if we wanted to. So I think I want the node, right? Because that's the actual newsletter. So now I can say node over here. And now here's all the information about the newsletter. I want the ID, I want the title, I want the date, I want the slug, and we'll leave it at that. I mean, we could grab more information, but again, this is me, the client, being very explicit about what I want back. I don't want everything back. These are the only fields I need for the particular use case that I'm using. So now if I close this and I hit this run, you can see that we get a single newsletter. So, and I was wrong before. So no matter what, this total count is going to tell us how many. The limit is just limiting what we return back. And so if we said, I want 3, and I can go ahead and run that. So this is an argument. We probably wouldn't want to hard code this, right? This is something we would want to go ahead and pass as a query variable. So we can do that, but first we need to, so if we say limit, that is the variable, we need to go ahead and set that up here. So let's call this find all newsletters. So again, this is optional unless you need to go ahead and define some argument types. So I will say limit is a int. That is the type. So now what I can do down here, and we'll get some code completion here, is I can say limit is 1. And there it is. So the reason I'm showing this is because this is a query language. This is kind of the first hurdle of understanding GraphQL. For the longest time when my website was up, I didn't understand the query language, to be honest. I would just like look at other examples and go, oh, okay, I kind of see what's going on there. What are these edges and nodes and what's that exclamation point and those brackets? And so don't do what I did and just try and guess. Go over to GraphQL Learn, graphql.org/learn, and go through this tutorial. This will teach you a lot of the different things like, hey, these are queries and mutations. Here are the different, here's the type system when we're setting up the schema and things like arguments and Scala types and enumerations, lists, and null. Everything that you need to understand, like the query language, you can find here in the documentation over at graphql.org/learn. So I would start there. Again, I really love this. And again, I really didn't know what I was doing forever. So let's just say, let's go back to all blog posts. Where are all our posts? So let's do this again. Let's say query. And the query is a top-level operation type. So inside of query, we need to pick one of these queries that we've set up. So setting them up is a different thing. We're going to do that today. We're going to do that in Spring Boot using Spring for GraphQL. But we're just using the client right now. So all posts. Now again, posts has some arguments that allow us to sort, order, skip, limit, etc. So let's go ahead and say that I want all posts and I want to limit to 5. Now what is inside of here? We get back a post connection. Again, similar as before. In post connection, we have total count. I'd like to know how many blog posts I have. I always try to type a comma here. I don't know why. And then we have edges. So edges is that collection. And inside of edges, we get a post edge, which has a node, which is the post. So we say node, and now that is the post that has everything we care about. So we can say I want the ID, I want the title, I want the slug, I want the date, and let's just, actually, is there a tag? So I didn't even look down there. You can start typing and get that auto completion, which is nice. So I do want some tags. So let's go ahead and run this. Oh, so we say all posts, edges, node, tags is probably, subsection. So in here we have, let's just say a title. So very helpful error messages too, telling us what we did wrong, what we can do to kind of fix that. So that's really nice. Let's go ahead and run that. And here we go. So we have 136 blog posts. We have the ID, the title, the date, whatever tags were a part of it. And here we go, just the data. So again, the query language is really great once you understand the kind of semantics behind it. Everything runs off. So there is a specification too, which is nice. So if you move from Java to JavaScript to Go, anybody who's implementing GraphQL needs to kind of work off of the spec. And so that's the way you know that that query that I'm writing now is not going to change from JavaScript to Java. It's going to be the same because each of the individual vendors are implementing that spec. The other thing is GraphQL was started by Facebook back in 2012. They had a similar problem. They have so much data returned to the client on the web, so on a desktop view, that again, it didn't matter. But as iOS and mobile started becoming more and more popular and even taking over desktop for certain sites, right? They needed a way to return less data and more targeted data. This is the exact data that we need, and we want it to be customizable for any client that is pulling information. So 2012, they open sourced it in 2015, and then I think 2017, a foundation was started. So it's no longer owned just by Facebook. There's a foundation behind it with a lot of really great companies. So if you care about that stuff, go ahead and read through here. That's pretty cool. But graphql.org, really great place to start with just GraphQL in general. So that is kind of the query data. Now, again, we're not going to get into it today, but there is something called a mutation. So a query is a way to get information out of the GraphQL API. A mutation is a way to update it, whether it's adding, editing, deleting, you would use a mutation for that. There is also a subscription, which allows you to pub sub something. So, you know, if you were wanting to keep checking something to see if something changed, by using a query, you'd have to query it, get it back, and then maybe a minute later, query it again to see if it changed. Subscriptions can use WebSockets behind the scene, open a connection, and do that polling so that you don't have to keep checking it. So great for applications like chat, you know, finance tickers, airlines, that kind of thing. So I think that's all I really want to cover here on my site. All right, so let's start. Any questions? Let me just double check here. Any questions out there? How are you guys doing? It's Wednesday, you staying alive? I know it's almost end of Wednesday for me, so we're getting there. But I'm also trying to finish this presentation for Chicago, so I need to get that done. I'm excited about this one though. I'm a big fan of GraphQL. I'm a big fan of GraphQL for Java, and extremely awesome to see what the Spring team has done with Spring for GraphQL that sits on GraphQL for Java, which we'll talk about. No questions, huh? Quiet crowd. Please feel free to ask questions. This is interactive, so jump on in if you want to. Let's GraphQL Java. Let's talk about that for a second. So there is a project called GraphQL Java, and this project is kind of the underpinning of everything we're going to do today. This was started back in 2015, you see by Andreas Mark. He gave a presentation at Spring 1, so if you want to see that, go check him. And oh my gosh, his name's escaping me now, but a member of the Spring for GraphQL team did a presentation with Andreas, and it was really good. And I've actually watched it a couple times already just to prepare for my talk, and I can't believe I'm missing his name. I'll get it though. So GraphQL Java is the kind of underlying library. There is no transport mechanism on this library. There's no HTTP, there's no WebSocket, there's no IO. This is simply an execution engine to take those queries that we are writing and process them and say, okay, based on the schema, based on the query that you're sending me, here's what I think you're going to get back. Or is that valid? You know, things like that. So what Spring for GraphQL does, Spring for GraphQL, let's jump over there. So if you're on Spring, you can go to projects, view all projects, Spring for GraphQL. You go over to learn, reference doc. Oh, and I want to talk about this. So 1.0.0 snapshot. So we're in a snapshot. Woo-hoo. Yes, we are getting closer and closer and closer. How close, you ask? Well, let's look. Did you know about this handy dandy calendar? If you watch Office Hours with Deshaun and I on Mondays over here on, well, actually, we're not on here yet. We will be on here soon. But if you follow our Twitch, we do an Office Hours every Monday morning. We use this calendar to kind of see what's coming this week. So this is basically telling you what releases are coming from the Spring team. See, we got a whole bunch of stuff coming down in April. But if we jump over to May and we look at Tuesday, May 17th, Spring Graph Spring for GraphQL 1.0.0. Oh, yes, Rawson, that's it. Thank you so much, Abu. That is exactly who I was trying to think of. Brilliant engineer. That presentation was awesome, so check that out. So yeah, so Spring for GraphQL 1.0.0 is on the 17th, and then Spring Boot 2.7.0 is on the 19th. And that's important because once you get past 2.6, you can now go ahead and use, now we can use Spring for GraphQL from start.spring.io. So that's now available as a starter, whereas if you tried to do that before, it wasn't there. So I love this. You can also turn that into a list and just see what's going on. So pretty cool stuff. So if you look at the overview, Spring for GraphQL provides support for Spring applications built on GraphQL for Java. It's a joint collaboration between both teams. So really working closely together. And I thought, you know, as we come up on a 1.0 release, it's really, really good. You know, 1.0s are never really great. Maybe in the Spring world we are. I just love what they've done with 1.0 just to make, you know, they took all the Spring kind of take something that's kind of hard to do. I don't want to configure all those things, and just give me some annotations and some configuration and make everything just work for me. So that's what they've done with Spring for GraphQL, just made everything on top of GraphQL, given us those, you know, transport mechanisms. So things like HTTP, WebSocket, you can use RSocket, giving us those transports on top of GraphQL for Java, or GraphQL Java. So I would suggest, if you're brand new to everything, start with just GraphQL, which is over on graphql.org/learn. This is the first place you can go. Then you can go to GraphQL Java. The reason, let's see, where's the documentation? You don't need to go through the getting started here, but these things over here are going to be important. So things like scholars, GraphQL for Java adds on top of the GraphQL basic scholars, like things like string, boolean, int, float, ID. We get things like long, short, byte, big decimal, big integer. So there's some more there. So good documentation to look through here. Then come over to here. But the first thing you're gonna do is watch me build something. So kind of clicks, and then you have the documentation here to always come back to. There's a bunch in here. One of the things, you know, two things we won't get to today are security and testing. Those are very important things in 1.0. Those have made it in, like how do you secure some of these APIs? How do you test these APIs? So these are important. There's also some samples down here. If you want to go over to the Spring for GraphQL repository, there's a bunch of different scenarios. All right, what we're going to do in just a second here, let me pull this out. I don't need this. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I just want to pull something up for reference. All right. I don't know if we're going to get to the front end too. I'm going to try to though. Okay, so we are here at start.spring.io. We're going to create a new project. I'm going to go ahead and choose the 2.7.0 milestone 3. We're getting very close to that. I'm going to use Maven Java. We're actually building out the demo that I'm going to use in my talk today. So we are working as a fictitious corporation called Waffle Corp. Waffle Corp Maybe this will be a good chance to bring up slides really quick. So Waffle Corp is this major provider of breakfast products that are available direct to consumer or through our strategic partnerships. And the current implementation of the e-commerce platform is in this monolithic Spring MVC application that serves data through a collection of REST APIs, right? So we've been asked to open up these APIs to both our partners, our iOS and Android applications, and IoT applications, right? And this becomes, if we're just allowing everyone to hit this REST service, it becomes a real customization challenge, right? Because all of these different clients need data in different formats. Not it's all going to be in JSON in our case, but it made me structure different. I only may need a few items on a mobile device where I want everything on, say, a web. So I won't go through too many slides. This is a code episode, but I just wanted to show you that. So we are com.waffle corp, call this store, and we are going to use Java 17. Let me just double check where we are. I jump around a lot, so I want to make sure we're on the right one. Yes, so we are on 17.0.2. No, not during a live presentation. So we're going to choose Java 17. Now we're going to come over here to the dependencies, and we're going to choose web. So I'm going to have the Spring web application. And I'm going to go ahead and look for GraphQL, and there's Spring GraphQL. Build GraphQL applications with Spring GraphQL and GraphQL for Java. So cool, we're going to select that. So I'm going to go ahead and generate that application. We will show this somewhere. I don't know what's in there, so let's go ahead and move that over here and drag this right here. So we're going to open this up in IntelliJ. I am using IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate. You can use whatever you need to. Community Edition, Visual Studio Code, NetBeans, Eclipse. So as this starts up, let's start thinking about what we need to do here. So an important thing to understand is that GraphQL is independent of our data layer. So what we're going to do today is have an in-memory representation of some products. We'll have things like modeled after, say, products and orders and order items and customers and reviews. I probably won't get to all of those today, but you get the idea. So the first thing that we need to start with is really a model. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a new package, and we'll call this model. And inside of here, I'm going to create a new Java. We're going to create a record. We'll call this product. Okay. So this product is going to be made up of an integer ID, a title. All right. Sometimes Maven wants to do its thing. What is going on here? I know this is a think this is because what are you doing to me, Maven? Can't even see Java. We have a bigger issue. So let me. All right, what is going on? Sometimes we go ahead. Can you check right Java SDK picked in IntelliJ? Yeah, it probably was because it's when I was using last. So yeah, 17's here. Again, I just closed it and open it. That's the power of restarting something. I'm not sure what happened, but all right. So now we have a record here. And the next thing that I want to do is talk about how we can go ahead and create some data for this particular, say, yeah, so let's do this. Let's create a new package. We will call this a repository. And inside of here, we will create a Java class called a product repository. We will say that this is a repository so that Spring can find it. And what we're going to do is just use this to create a in-memory representation of some products. Restart always works. Of course it does. Okay, so what I want to do first is I want to create a list of product. We'll call this products. And we'll initialize this to a new array list. Next, what I want to do is go ahead and I think just initialize some data. So I'm going to have a private method here, private void init, and we'll use post construct. If you're not familiar with what post construct is, this annotation is used on a method that needs to be executed after dependency injection is done to perform any initialization. So the reason you would use this as opposed to just doing something in the constructor, we just want to make sure at some point we may need to get orders or order items, and we may, inject some other classes in here, and we want to make sure that they're available. For now, we're just doing a simple product. So I'm going to say products.add. We're going to say new product, and the product is going to take an ID. Yummy. Say yummy waffles. These are the best waffles ever. Yes, I'm a little bit hungry. Do not live code while you're hungry. All right, so we have, I got a question here. So sorry if this was mentioned, but it sounds like you're not using the good mic. Really? Let's double check this. I should be using the good mic. Test, test. Does that not sound good? I am showing that it's using this one and not my AirPods. So Sorry if that's not the case. That's weird. Okay, so I've added a product. So now I can have some method in here, say public. I'm going to return a list of product. We'll call this find all. And this is just going to return products. Okay, so that is just our basics product repository. Again, it's using an in-memory array list to just store some products. Again, the reason I want to kind of be specific about that is GraphQL does not care about your data later. So we're using it in memory. If you're using Spring Data JPA, Spring Data JDBC, raw JDBC, if you're the adventurous type, whatever you're doing to pull data, fetch data from a database or write data to a database, persist data, that doesn't matter to GraphQL. You'll see that we will describe the endpoint or the kind of queries, mutations, subscriptions. We're going to describe those and then ask our repositories for the data. So that's that. Let's go in here and create a new package. Call this controller. And inside of here, we will create a new Java class called product controller. Now we're going to annotate this with @controller. Now we aren't serving up static HTML or using timeleaf or anything like that. This is just, again, in Spring, this is a generic stereotype that has annotated with @component. So it now just lets Spring for GraphQL find your controller. So we're going to annotate methods on the controller, and that's going to help GraphQL kind of figure things out. So there's that. So we may have a method here. Let's see. First off, we need our product repository. So we're going to say private final product repository. Let's call it a repository. And we're going to get that through a constructor injection. So there it is. We may have a method that returns a list of product. We could call this, let's call this all. Actually, let's start off with the more verbose and we'll work our way backwards. So find all products. And this is just going to return the repository.findAll. So now if we were to fire this up in the context of, say, a REST API, you know, we would have a REST controller here, we'd have a request mapping, we'd have, say, a Git mapping for this one. What we need to do is, so kind of the two pillars of GraphQL, the query language that we saw at the beginning. So the query language is how we define what we're asking the GraphQL server for. The other side of it is on the server side, we need to define the types, the GraphQL types. So if you were to jump into the documentation, you would see this, but by default, there's a configuration that says, hey, we're going to look for your schema types in a folder under resources called GraphQL. This can be changed if you wanted to. But we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this, let's say waffles.graphqls. Okay, so here's where we start to define our schema. So again, if you were to go back to the documentation for GraphQL, the first thing that you would look at is in the Schema and Types. There's a type system. There's a type language. The first thing that we have in here is like these object types and fields. So the most basic component of GraphQL schemas are object types, which just represent a kind of object you can fetch from your service and what fields it has on it. In GraphQL schema language, we might represent it like this. So we have a type and we're calling it character. In our case, we'll have a type and we'll call it product. And product has fields on it. So this could be a one-to-one mapping to that record that we just created. It could not be. Maybe you don't want to expose certain fields on your GraphQL schema. And this is pretty easy to set up. And if you want to go through here again, there's some information about what these things are doing, but we'll talk through them. So we need to create a type for our product. So we can say type, and we're going to give it a name. We'll say product. So we need a couple things. First, we need an ID, and there is a Scholar type in GraphQL called ID. Again, this exclamation point is telling anyone who consumes this API that you're going to always get an ID back. It will not be null. So now we're kind of just one-to-one with this, right? So we have a string title and a string description. So we can say title, and that's a string, and we can say description, and that's a string. So that is our product type, but that doesn't get us everything yet, right? That just defines what a product is, so that when I'm querying it and I want to get a product back, the GraphQL server knows what fields are available on product. Okay, remember back when we were going through the GraphQL Playground, we had a way to use that Query Explorer and start to type out things, right? One of those things, again, the top level operations in GraphQL, query, mutations, subscriptions. The queries are what's going to allow us to read information. So we have to define those. So we could say, hey, guess what? I'm going to define some queries for you. And so what are those queries going to look like? Well, one of those queries is, I want to get all of the products back. That is the name of the query that we can call. And what is that going to return? That is going to return a collection. So we have a collection of product. So now if we save that, this is the first thing that we need to do to kind of set that up. Just looking to see if we have any questions. Doesn't look like it. Okay, now that we've set this up, we need to go back into the product controller, and somehow we need to map this method right here, to the schema, to the query that we just created. So we created a query called all products, and that's going to return a collection of product. So how do we do that here? So again, this is where Spring for GraphQL comes in. It's adding that IO layer. It's in this case, we're going to use HTTP. This is the ability to go ahead and query the GraphQL server for this stuff. So we need to map this method to that query. And the way that we can do that is a couple ways. One is the long form, so schema mapping. And inside of schema mapping, it's going to ask for a couple things. It's going to say, hey, what is the type name? In this case, the type is, what is that top level type? And in that case, it's a query, right? So it's a query. And what is the type name, right? Type name. So what is the type name? So this type name corresponds to this. So we can say all products and, oh, whoops. Sorry, value. I think I got that backwards. Type name is query. Why did I do that? Okay, and then I want to actually start with the type name. And that is all products. Oops. Okay, so this is the long form of it. We'll kind of get into it, test this out, and then I'll show you there's a kind of easier way to do this. So no matter what this name is, we have specifically told it, here's how you're going to map to my schema. The schema type is a query, could be a mutation, could be a subscription. The value is all products. Again, that's what we named it right here. So we're almost ready to run this application. I just want to do one more thing in application.properties. I just want to show you a couple properties. So if you start typing GraphQL, There's a GraphQL. This is the graphical UI, similar to the one that we saw earlier. We want to go ahead and enable that locally because we want to go ahead and test some things out. The other thing is the path. So by default, everything is run on one single path, so /GraphQL. You know, in a REST API, we may have stuff like API/products, API/orders, and then even, you know, /API/products/123/reviews. So we have this REST kind of architecture, right, we're used to working with. In GraphQL, we have just a single endpoint. And everything to this endpoint is actually a post. You're posting a query, that query that we wrote. So if there is a downside to GraphQL, one of the things that comes up is caching, because you can't cache a post request. At least I'm not aware of a way. I know that's kind of one of the cons here with GraphQL. Oh, there's my buddy. Hey, Java Grunt. Okay, so I don't need to enable this. I just wanted to show that so that you knew that it was there. So after all of that, now we can go ahead and run this. And what I hope we can do now is we can go to this UI, start to practice our query language. So you'll see the GraphQL endpoint is HTTP post on /GraphQL. So if we go over here to localhost 8080, GraphQL, you get this nice interface that we can go ahead and test some queries out with. So again, you'll see different interfaces on different GraphQL implementations. The one we saw earlier was called Graphql Playground. This one is called GraphQL. But this gives you the ability, and what I really love about this is it kind of starts you out with a bunch of information too. Like, hey, here's what an example looks like. Here's some shortcuts if you want to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of everything actually. And I want to jump over here to docs. So the first thing that it's going to do, remember, it's going to introspect that GraphQL server, and it's going to see, all right, what is there based on that schema definition, and it's going to produce some documentation for me. So I have docs. So there are queries. There's at least one query. There's a query called all products, which returns to me a collection of products. That product is going to return an ID. Again, exclamation point says it will always return a value. And then it's going to return title and description. So let's go ahead and type this out. So we're going to say query. We're going to say all products. And that is going to return the product. So what do we want from the product? We want the ID, we want the title, and we want the description. And if we go ahead and run this, there it is. So pretty cool. You can start to see now, we're just working with products right now. As we start to build out this schema for our entire project, we're going to have products, orders, order items, customers, reviews. All of that data is available on this /GraphQL endpoint. And it's now up to us as a client to tell the server how we want the data returned to us. So you get as much as you want or as little as you want. Again, you have to be very explicit over here what you want. If you don't include that, it will not come back. So that was the all products. Let's look at a way to get a single product. So let's say I wanted to, so I want to return a product, and we'll call this find one. Actually, I'm going to call this something different. Let's call this get product. And let me just return null for now. So let's go over to our repository. And what I want to do here is I'm going to create a product, find one. It's going to take in an integer ID. And now I need a way to find that one specific product. So I can say return products.stream.filter. I want to get the product product.id, and that should be equal to ID. I want to find the first, or else just say no. Okay, so that'll get us one single product. So now back in my controller, I want to say, how do I get this particular argument? So I want to say integer ID. So now if we were in something like a REST controller, we have things available, annotations available to us like path variable or query, request body, we have all these things that we can do to kind of get that information. In a GraphQL, we are going to treat that as an argument. So argument, and that'll get passed in now. So now what I can say is repository.find1 and pass in the argument or the ID. So I want to show you now, we got to go back to the schema definition, and we have to set up a query for Git Product. So we're just going to create a new query. We're going to call it Git Product, and this is just going to return a single product. This is called Git Product. When this name of the method is the same as the name of the query here in our schema definition, we can do a little shortcut here. We can say query mapping. So query mapping is basically just a short form of this. It's going to insert this as a type name of query, and the value is going to be the name of the method. So it's the exact same thing as saying schema method, schema mapping, type name is query, value is Git Product. Just as in, we have the request mapping annotation for REST controllers. We have specialized versions of those like Git mapping, post mapping, etc. This is just kind of a specialized version of that. And you can see that schema name, or at schema mapping with the type name of query, and then it will grab the field. So let's get rid of this. And now let's go ahead and restart this. We'll head back over to GraphQL. And now we need to get a single product. So I want to say, let's go ahead and refresh this actually. So now we have a Git product, and that takes in, oh, we didn't set up the argument. Sorry, I forgot that. So over here, we need to go ahead and set up the argument in here. And so this is going to be an ID, and it's going to be of type ID. And we want to make sure that this is not null. So again, I kind of found that out just by looking here at the docs that were generated and realized there was a problem. Now we can see this takes in an ID. So we can say Git product, and we can say ID is equal to 1. And what do I want on that product? I want the ID, title, and description. So if we run that, we get this. If we were to say 2, we get null. Cool, any questions so far? I really wish I need to find a way to stream to our different channels using, so right now I'm using StreamYard, which I like, but I gotta do one of two things. I'm either gonna just stop being cheap and buy Loopback so that I can go ahead and stream some music behind, or find a way to use my Ecamm software. I just like having music, especially if I'm gonna sit here and code for 2 hours. It'd be nice to have some music. All right, so we got a question here. Imagine we have 10 fields in a database and the same fields defined in GraphQL model. On the client side, I need only 2 fields out of 10. How do we map that from GraphQL request to data layer? Okay, so great question. So we're going to define everything on here. So if you had 12 fields, you're going to define all 12 of those on product. What happens is there's a data fetching function that backs every single one of these fields. So it knows that when you are asking for ID, it knows how to go get the value of ID. And the way that it does this performantly in GraphQL for Java is it can do all, if it doesn't need information back from one query, it can do all these kind of in parallel. So it knows that I've asked for ID, title, and description. It's going to go out there and get those three and return it back. If I only want the title, even though I've defined 3 fields over on my schema, it's only going to bring back the title because it knows that that's all we've asked for. So it's not, it's not querying a data, it's not asking for everything to come back. Good question though. I mentioned this earlier too, but this, if we don't want to hard code this, if we want to make this a variable, we could do that. So let's just say that this is product ID. So now I've declared this product ID of type ID. Oops. Product ID. Product ID, product ID. Let's see what this says. Variable product is user position expecting. Oh, that's why. So, okay. So now what I can do is come down here and use query variables, and I can say a product ID is 1, and now we've kind of made this dynamic, right? So again, arguments, scholar types, all the things that we're talking about, they're all in the documentation over on graphql.org. So again, ID is a scholar type. So if we go into scholar types, we have int, float, string, boolean, and ID. And then it says in most GraphQL service implementations, there's also a way to specify custom scholar types. For example, if we want to do that, we can define a date. And as I mentioned earlier, GraphQL for Java does that, giving us things like long, shorts, bytes, big decimal, big and integer. All right. Let's see, what else can we do today? I think that maybe I'm going to call it there. Again, I would hope to stream for 2 hours today. But man, whatever is going around the house, I am starting to get, which is not a good thing. It is my wife's birthday this weekend, so I do not want to be sick for that. But I'll hang out for a few minutes. Any questions, anything you'd like to see? Maybe we can continue this in another stream. So that means we query all the fields defined in the model from the database. Only GraphQL engine filters the fields required for that client. So we can get access to the query if we want to get specific on it. So let's take a look at the documentation. So right here, good question. So let's say on this one, we get this argument, we get an ID. There are other arguments that are passed to each of our handler methods. Let's go look at that. So annotated controllers. So we have a query mapping, schema mapping. Here is the method signature. This is what I was looking for. So schema mapping handler methods can have any of the following method arguments. So first, we can find out what the arguments are. Argument or a list of arguments. The projected payload for access to field arguments through a project interface. See projected payload. Yeah, I got your question. So I'm just trying to understand how to read only those fields. So you don't want to do a select star on the database if all they're asking for is the title. Got it. So let's take a look at this. So we want to see, what is this? Projected payload. I know one of these are going to get me what I want. I'm just trying to. Yes, the data fetching environment. I mean, that's what we want. Provides access to the source, i.e. the parent container instance of the field. To access this, simply declare a method parameter of the expected target type. So let's see what this does. Right? So stop this. We are going to debug this. And let's run this. Cannot vote object that class because source is null. Why is source null? That's for a mutation. That'll give you that, but not what I'm looking for. Argument annotation does not have a required flag. I have the option to specify default. Both of these. Binding fields. You can use add argument on a map of string of object argument to obtain all the argument values. The name attribute argument must not be set. Yep, a string of objects. So let's try that. All right, so that's the only argument that's coming over, which makes sense. So we want to find out is what is the, I feel like this has got to be it. GraphQL context. Yeah, now let's. I'll have to dig into that. That's a great question. Yeah, just to reiterate what the question is. If this was this repository was connected to a real database, you know, maybe we don't want to grab. Yeah, I guess, yeah, it really does depend on the use case. Like for me, like if it has 10 fields, I don't care if it grabs all 10, but you're right. In certain situations where there's a large database with a lot of columns on that table, yeah, you wouldn't want to just grab all of them. So how can I get access to the query that was being posted? How can I get access to that and find out what fields the client wants so that I can only query those fields? Good question. I'll have to figure that out. I'm not sure. Because again, everything that I've done has been small enough to where I don't really care. I'm querying the database. I'm just not, you know, responding with that load. Awesome live. I have to drop, but we'll see the recording later. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Gabriel. Appreciate you showing up. Any other questions? Anything else we can look at? Again, I have one question to bring back, and I may use that question for office hours next week, so I have something to take a look at. But we will continue this, maybe not on code, but on my Twitch, maybe tomorrow, see how I'm feeling. And we'll get more into kind of building out the CRUD of products, which will allow us to create, update, and delete. So those are going to be mutations. I don't know if we're going to get into any subscriptions in this demo because I'm just not going to show them in the presentation. So probably won't do that. But we'll build this out and then we'll create some other schemas for like orders, order items, customers, reviews. And then we'll talk about like how this works in maybe a distributed world where each of those things are kind of microservices. How does that work? So maybe we'll find the answer in office hours. Yes, if you don't get it before Monday, you will have it by Monday. See, the great thing I love about my job is now I get to go in Slack and ask all these brilliant engineers who have worked on this how to do that. I mean, I'm going to Google it first, but I get to ask them, and it's great. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think with that, I will call it a show. Thanks for showing up with me on a Wednesday and watching me hack away at some code. Again, we're going to do this again very soon. If you're not already subscribed to my Twitch channel, please do that. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to find out where I am on all these social things, the best place to do that is danvega.dev. If you look down here, there's a bunch of links: Twitter, GitHub, YouTube, Reddit, Instagram, which I gotta take off here. I don't use Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. So learn more about me at danvega.dev. Also sign up for my newsletter that goes out every single Monday-ish. Say Monday-ish because I didn't do that this week. Again, kids were sick last week and that takes precedence. So, which I really hope I'm not catching this. Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for all the great questions. Appreciate it. All right. So until next time, as always, friends, happy coding.